Okay, so we're going to do another session. It'll probably be about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions and discussions. Just a few more topics that want to go through, and then we have a lot of slides that we can use for backup also, if there's different topics that people would like to talk about. But before we get started, any questions you thought of during the break about what we had talked about during the first session? Yes. Sure.
Do you think that the truth will ever get into the school books?
I think, so I'll speak in the United States, I think there will always be a set of school books that are just 100% controlled by atheists and humanists. But in the United States, there's also a lot of, I think now 11% of all families with school-aged children are homeschooling, and so that's a large percentage. And then there's a lot of states now that are having what they call school choice. So, they're finding that a lot of like the Christian schools, just the academic performance of the students is better than the public schools. A lot of the homeschools the average homeschooler now is the 85th percentile. So in other words, the average homeschooler performs better than 85% of the public school students. So it's hard to ignore. And so they're now talking school choice, where you'd actually get a small amount of money to pull your child out of a public school and send them to any school you want to. So it wouldn't have to be a Christian school. It could be any school, but it's just because of how well the other schools are performing. And so I think there'll always be a set of textbooks that are controlled by people that are against the Bible, against Christianity, but I think there's also a lot of positive movement towards people. And then the other one we were talking a little bit about the break, a little light goes a long way. And so if you just objectively present the facts to any student, then they'll have those. And then when they hear something that doesn't quite make sense to them, but they don't know why, then that'll help a lot. So that was like the free choice, just the free will, because again, no one's going to tell them that somehow you can make choices without a soul, because it doesn't work, and so just having the child. And that can be it's the classic, like a 4-year-old, if they take a cookie and they weren't supposed to, and you ask them if that was their choice, they think, well, I'm in big trouble now because they're getting technical on me. Well, in reality, you can use that as a teaching moment. Well, it was your choice, and that was the wrong choice, but realize that you do have that choice, and that's one of the things that God gives us, is the ability to make choices, good choices, bad choices. So, but then when they go into these school settings where they're being told, well, no, you don't have a soul, you should believe that you just evolved from bacteria made itself, and that'll give them something to say, well, I know that's not right, because I remember getting in trouble for taking the cookie. So but just really talk to people from a young age. And then the life making itself from non-life. In the United States, it's a tradition at kindergarten.
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I can't see your mouth.
Oh, okay. See, you gotta try. You can hear me or you can't see me. But anyway, so it's kind of a tradition. The first day of first grade or kindergarten, they take finger paints and they put it on the child's hand, and they, give a handprint on a piece of paper, and they send it home. And then the parents save it for the next 50 years or 100 years, or so and it's great. I love it. But if life could make itself, literally, if life could make itself, anything that just happens randomly is so simple that your child should be bringing home the life they made. And it's not a totally flippant example. In other words, if life could actually make itself, then we should be able to design our first grade classrooms to have enough laboratory equipment to make life. Because that's how simple things that happen randomly. I mentioned the bonfires. Well, of course, if you go out hiking, and again, I give U.S. examples, but a lot of times the trail is just marked. Someone took a hatchet, they put a little mark on a tree, and a lot of times they'll like spray paint it a certain color, because if there's a lot of trails in the area, you want the same trail. We think about you're hiking out in the middle of the woods, and you're trying to stay on the blue trail, and every time you see a blue dot, well, that's the next trail. So even that level of design, we're basically, determining whether or not we're going to spend the night lost in the woods based on this hatchet with a blue spray paint. Hasn't, and because it never crosses their mind to think, well, well, we had that big windstorm last week. I wonder if it picked up a hatchet and went down this way, and then this can of blue spray paint was right behind it. It's like, no, I mean, so very simple things we still know don't happen randomly. So that might be the second one to explain to a child, because we have a grandson now, and it's just fun because all the stuff he forgot to do. I mean, he will just stare at a bug, and even you're not even sure the bug's alive, and then it'll eventually move and stuff, but he'll just, because he's just fascinated by it. So you just point out, that bug is more sophisticated than an airplane, and it is, because, and then the easy way to explain that is, again, we can make airplanes, we can't make bugs, and so then that clicks. And so even if they do end up going to a school where they're being taught all of these, I'll just say anti-science atheistic theories, they're still going to realize that they'll know when they're hearing that it's not true. Now then, that's the next tricky part, is how to keep them from getting in trouble with that knowledge. And that is actually one of my first memories when I first started knowing there's something different. And I just call them the good kids. It turns out they were the Bible believers, but they were the good kids. Well, the good kids never get in trouble, right? And so, but I'm in ninth grade biology class, and like most ninth graders, I'm just sitting in back, not paying any attention, trying to, just wait for the class to end. Well, the subject was evolution. So they're talking about evolution. I have no idea what they were talking about, but I just noticed the good kids started contradicting the teacher, okay? So then the really strange thing is the good kids, and these were the Bible believers, well, they actually stayed very respectful. Because then that's how we're supposed to behave as Christians, speak the truth in love. The teacher, he literally started like insulting him. It was almost like it's just like personal insults, and so that really caught my attention. So that's the only thing I remember about that. Well, what perked me up was the good kids are getting in trouble, because that's always exciting. But the second one was just, oh, wait a second, this is really strange, because they're the ones acting like adults, and like I'd actually never seen an adult act like that towards a kid. So when you train up your child, you realize that, hey, be careful. So be careful, because I've had people ask me that too, and then I know they ask everybody, well, they have professors that hear, how do I reach my professor? A lot of times they'll say, well, start out by reaching your friends, and explain to your friends why you disagree with what the professor's saying. Get them the resources, the books, the websites, and then the professor, it's going to be so personality dependent. But the last thing I think anybody's going to be able to get away with, college you can sometimes get away with it, you usually get in trouble, but they realize they can't get you into trouble. But boy, if you're a junior high school student or a high school student and you start contradicting your professor in front of the class, I mean, it's just not going to play out well. So it's, by play out well, I mean, he's going to dig in his heels, and your classmates are going to know what's going on, so, I mean, you can contradict him, but just in a certain way. So anyway, that's a tough one. But sorry, again, very long answer. I think there's always going to be a lot of schools where they basically are teaching atheism, even though they're saying that they don't want to teach religion. That's the religion they're teaching right now. But I think there's also a lot of options for parents and friends and people we know. But make sure they have the options. And that's why we brought, those are just some books we could fit in our suitcase, but there's so many good resources out there. And I think Ice mentioned Apologetics Press has good resources, a website, and just, again, anything that anyone's interested in, let us know. We'll try to get them shipped over here to the congregation and make them available. So this is we'll talk a little bit about now, because straightforward reading the Bible, and people add up the genealogies, and we mix in some secular history, looking at an age of the earth of about 6,000 years. And so a lot of times I'll just say less than 10,000 years. And so the big the debate over that was, if you use radiometric dating with certain assumptions, you end up, I think right now people are saying 4.54 billion years. Well, that's a big difference. You're talking 6,000 years versus 4.54 billion years. And they even have terms for it. Some people say old Earth, young Earth. So just to be annoying, a lot of times if someone say, well, are you old Earth or young Earth? I always say, well, I'm old Earth, because 6,000 years, that's a long time. you know, and so, but but what they're usually meaning is this 4.54 billion versus 6. Like to talk about this because one of those key assumptions, it's been refuted, but not in a confrontational way, but since about 2006. And that key assumption was that radioactive decay rates have always been the same. And in 2006, you started having, again, it's good when it's secular sources start reporting things. So this was Ohio State and Stanford and Purdue started reporting that their radioactive decay rates were fluctuating in their medical isotopes. And the professor emeritus at Stanford, he's actually an elderly gentleman. He actually worked on, really helped us perfect radar during World War II. And he was really young, so a brilliant guy. He's the one that's been pushing this, so that how can you apply this? So that's helped a lot also, because now you have these people with these tremendous reputations that are pursuing this area of research. And so, but with that fact, so the decay rates are fluctuating right now, and then a lot of the articles, they'll even say, well, they're fluctuating, but it's not enough to change our, significantly change our dating, our age estimates. And so that's the one where, we talk about, true science advancing. Well, the true science will need to advance more. I'm not sure how it will advance in this area, but to me it's, okay, they're fluctuating now and they're supposed to be stable. We have no idea why they're fluctuating. And so if they're fluctuating now, though, while physically the Earth and the universe are stable, what might they have been doing during creation week or the flood? And that's about as far as I can go, because I can't. And so then I'm starting to think, okay, how would we ever know how they changed during the flood? How would we ever know how they changed during creation week? And I can't think of a way scientifically we're going to measure today how those decay rates were different during the flood or creation week. Now there could be a way, and so I'm not saying there isn't a way, it's just that's one of those ones where, is there a path where we could say, okay, we know during the flood this is how they changed, and we know during creation week this is how they changed. But just when we look at all the other areas of science as they've advanced, that's what, again, where we figure out, okay, well, based on the fluctuations we see today in this new data, it will end up being consistent with the Bible, but we're not quite there yet. So I just want to address this a little bit, because that's a lot of times people will, because again, to me, just once we realize we have free will, we can make choices, and we realize that we can't make a bacteria even though we can make rockets and airplanes and computers, that should be enough to get someone to objectively consider the Bible. But a lot of times it's not. And so that's why this is just kind of, okay, what are these other areas? Well, this is one area. I mean, in other words, if you think about it, is someone really going to reject the Bible because they don't understand the dating methods? And some people will. I've had people, I had one person once tell me, we were studying in Peru, and he seemed like a nice guy, but he said, well, he had read that there was a rock in the South Pacific that could only form given millions of years. And so I'm like, okay, which rock is it? Well, I don't remember. Okay, well, where in the South Pacific? Well, the article said, but I don't remember. But then you start thinking, it's like, okay, why are you really not considering the Bible? Because if literally you look at all the evidence that we need to consider the Bible as God's inerrant word, all of the evidence that the creation is true, are you really going to reject all that because you read some article that you can't remember, that there was this rock that can only do this? So, that said, I was the same way. Again, it took, I'm really glad whoever asked that question because I had to have the I'll call it like the subconscious knowledge that science was in favor of the Bible to start with, but that wasn't enough to make me all of a sudden objectively consider the Bible. So anyway, along those lines, this is just some ideas. We'll spend a few minutes talking about the age. Now, from the dating, if you look at all the ways you could estimate the age of the Earth, almost all of them, a lot of people say 90% of them are very consistent with the Earth being less than 10,000 years old. And so you look at like sediment on the seafloor. Well, so what the idea there is you measure how deep is the sediment on the seafloor, how fast is it, flowing in from erosion. So you look at all the rivers. We have all this data now, a ton of data. But just and then how fast it's being removed by plate tectonics, and that limits the age of the seafloor to much much younger than what the evolutionary assumptions would make. And if you take into account effects of the flood, and someone will say, well, you're just, but we know there's a flood from the Bible. Taking into account reasonable effects of the flood becomes completely consistent with the biblical timeline. Okay, so you imagine just how much sediment's coming in, how much is going out, and how long would it take to get the depth that we see today. So that's very consistent. Bent rock layers. There is a really good DVD back there. It's called Is Genesis History? And so I think it might even be available just online. You just, but either way, just that's a really good one to watch because it explains all the, we have these bends in these rock layers. Some are like hundreds of feet, but there's no cracks in the bend. So I got to go down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon once, and you look at it, it's just this nice bend, but it had to be bent while that rock was still soft. So it's very consistent with it being formed during the flood, and then like you have some tectonic activity uplifting, but if that rock had hardened, it would have crumbled. It'd be just like taking that coffee cup, and if I decided, hey, I really want it to be rectangular, well, if I try to do that now, it's not going to work. But if while that clay was soft before I fired it, you could do it. So it's the same idea. So that's the bent rock layers. The other thing on rock layers, though, is you'll notice you have the layers. There's no erosion between the layers. And so what I mean by that is you'll have these rock layers. You might have 100 layers of rock, it's like this thing. They might say, well, that's millions and millions of years old, but there's no erosion between the layers. And so you think about like if you were to, say you're building a house and you flattened the ground, you made it really smooth and you're just ready to pour the foundation, and then you left it. Well, if you came back a year later, it's going to have all kinds of plants growing through it. You'll have animals that will have dug through it. You'll have water channels cut by a rainstorm. You'll have all this erosion. So you know that very quickly things like that erode. When we look at these layers, there's no local erosion between the layers. So you know they had to be laid down very quickly. So you have all this bent rock layers, the no erosion between layers. Again, very consistent with those layers being laid down during the flood. And I won't, again, the movie, it's really good cinematography and, very good to watch. So I just highly recommend that one. Soft Tissue and Fossils, when I was growing up, that's probably the first book I remember reading. It's one of those we catch someone, like 4 or 5 years old, and you have someone read you a book long enough so that you memorize all the words, so you can pretend you're reading it to somebody. And so that was that book, and it was talking about dinosaurs, because everybody loves dinosaurs. And at that time, the last dinosaurs went extinct 50 million years ago. Now it's 68 million years ago. I am getting older, but I think that something else had to change also. But anyway, so 50 million years ago, these dinosaurs went extinct, and that was why you never find soft tissue in dinosaur fossils. They're just going to be, just probably, well, now we're finding soft tissue. And that's an example of how this drive towards trying to be atheistic really set science back. You can look at vestigial organs if we want to talk about. There are certain organs and structures in our body that we didn't study because we were told, like really back in like the late 1800s, that they're just useless evolutionary leftovers. And it's about the year 2003 until we figured out, well, every one of those organs and structures had an important function. So again, this belief trying to pretend that science supported evolution or trying to make these arguments up for evolution, it really held science back. Well, this was another area. We weren't even bothered looking for soft tissue in dinosaur fossils. Because, what kind of crazy person, we all know it can't be there. Well, someone accidentally found some, and it started to get publicized about 2006. And now every time you section a large dinosaur bone, not every time, but a lot of times you find soft tissue. So, but again, the premise that there's no way soft tissue could last for millions of years is totally true. And so the whole point is that's the reason you're finding the soft tissue is those bones are not millions of years old. And so most of the bones that we're finding, they were probably buried during the flood. Rapidly decaying magnetic field, the total energy in the Earth's magnetic field is actually going down exponentially. And so that's very consistent with that magnetic field being created on the order of 6,000 years ago, and then just doing the way magnetic fields naturally decay away, the energy in the magnetic fields. Now, there was a physicist at Sandia National Laboratory specialized in magnetic fields. Now, a lot of like Sandia, Los Alamos, Livermore, a lot of the national labs in the U.S. they were put in place for during the Cold War, and a lot of very high-tech research. So he led a lot of the magnetic field work with that laboratory. So really smart guy. But he also predicted the magnetic fields that the Voyager probe would find at Uranus and Neptune before the probe got there. Okay, and his predictions were completely different than the secular predictions. He was right. Okay, and he based his on a biblical theory that he's developed. And so, but he's the first one to say his theory could be completely wrong. But it's just kind of interesting that his theory was right, the other one was wrong. It's kind of like the James Webb Space Telescope. You know, it made certain predictions about people were making predictions about the James Webb Space Telescope, what it would see. Saw things totally different, right? And so again, that was because of their assumptions. And like we talked about before the break, rather than, I guess, you know, our assumptions are wrong or maybe the Big Bang's wrong, they just kind of adjusted some parameters and tried to keep moving forward. But anyway, the rapidly decaying magnetic field would show the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. Helium and radioactive rocks. Okay, that's an interesting one. If you walked into this afternoon session and there had been a helium balloon floating in the corner, I mean, a lot of times you might have thought, oh, they must have had a birthday party here or something, you know. And unfortunately, it's a very high probability when you give a child a helium balloon, the child's going to accidentally let go of it, balloon goes up, and you better get the balloon back. You know, but anyway, you know, but if someone had said, no, when this building was first built, they had a grand opening, and that helium balloon, you know, floated up, and it's been there ever since. Yeah, you kind of question that. So and the reason is the helium diffuses out of the balloon. And so when you have the helium and the radioactive rocks, well, you can measure how fast the helium diffuses out of those. That's usually zircons. And so you can measure how fast the helium will diffuse out of those zircons. And you realize that, yes, there's a lot of helium created, but it had to be created recently. And again, this is another, you know, long talk, but not really long, but yeah, we'll do it a different time. But when uranium-238 decays to lead-206, you release 8 helium atoms. So that's where the helium comes from. The fact that most of that helium is still there means that a lot of uranium decayed to lead, but it had to happen recently. So that ties back to the accelerated radioactive decay rate. So it's another good clue. Okay, so that, again, it's kind of subtle. Carbon-14 has a 5,730-year half-life. Anybody ever buy or just go by, like, read a diamond advertisement or advertisement for diamonds or go buy diamonds? Or how do they usually say the diamonds are? If they say that. You know, they'll say millions of years. I was up at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. They said, here's the Hope Diamond. It's 1 billion years old. Okay, well, you find carbon-14 in diamonds. Okay, so if half of it goes away every 5,730 years, you can run the math, and literally within 90,000 years, you're not going to be able to detect any carbon-14. So that doesn't say it's consistent with 6,000 years. It doesn't prove the Earth is 10,000 years old, but you know it can't be more than 100,000 years old. Otherwise, you wouldn't have this carbon-14 in diamonds. You also find it in fossils, and coal. Coal is supposed to be 300 million years old. Let's see, we did the car analogy, so I'll work in the math one real quick here. If I said I'm going to give you a penny now, 2 pennies tomorrow, 4 pennies the next day, 8 pennies the next day, and do that for 2 months, or I'll give you 100 euros right now, what would you do? Would you take the pennies or take the euros? Okay, and I actually really appreciate that because that means you trust me. Probably realistically take the 100 euros, but you're right, because if you did the pennies and doubled it for 2 months, you'd have all the worst wealth in the world and then some. So if you could really do that. So it's the same thing in reverse with this radioactive decay. Very little salt in the sea. That's analogous to the same as the sediment on the seafloor. And then DNA in ancient bacteria. This is an interesting one because with the DNA in ancient bacteria, they'll claim that this DNA is like 200 and something million years old sometimes, but it's exactly the same as the DNA we see in bacteria today. It's within the range of what you can see today. So it's kind of like, even though that's said to be evidence for old age, I mean, you think about it, the DNA wouldn't be existing still if it was that old. And then even if it was somehow existing after that long, why hasn't, because that would have been supposedly frozen in time 200 something million years ago. Why hasn't it changed at all if evolution's happening? So that's an odd one. You'll hear that one every time. So those are all, again, very consistent with a relatively young Earth. And so I just talked briefly on radiometric dating. It's depending on what you're trying to date, it's used different isotopes. So like carbon-14, that's usually for things that are believed to be less than 50,000 years old. I mean, again, that's across the board. With carbon-14, there was a lot of carbon buried during the flood. And so with carbon-14, you have to assume an initial carbon-14 to carbon ratio. So for example, say this wood here, right now that wood would have about 1 out of every trillion atoms would be a carbon-14 atom. If we came back in 5,730 years, 1 out of every 2 trillion would have, because half of the carbon-14 would have decayed away. Wait another 5,730 years, it'd be 1 out of 4 trillion. Wait another 5,730 years, it'd be 1 out of every 8 trillion. So it's pretty straightforward on how it works. But you notice we had to know what that ratio was today. Okay, so when you get back close to the time of the flood, because of all of the carbon that was buried during the flood, this is another one where secular scientists, Christians agree there was a lot more carbon in the biosphere a long time ago. For us, a long time ago, it would be before the flood. For secular scientists, pick a number, it'd be longer, older. But that change in ratio caused by the carbon buried during the flood, when seawater heats up, it releases CO2. And so you get a lot of discussion about that today. So if the oceans were warm during the flood, that would have changed the carbon-14 to carbon ratio. And so what we notice and what we would expect is back about 3,000 years, carbon dating is pretty accurate. But then when you get close to the time of the flood, that's where you start getting these inaccuracies. So you'll get carbon dates. People say, oh, I carbon dated this to be 20,000 years old or 30,000 years old. But that's just because the carbon-14 to carbon ratio was lower close to the flood, because all these effects that were caused by the flood. Okay, so that's about a 2-hour discussion compressed into 2 minutes, but that's carbon dating. And again, we can talk as long as anyone wants afterwards, because it's a fun topic. Now the other topics that are used for radiometric dating, like a lot of times you'll have a potassium argon, and that's used to date lava flows. And so one of the things you'll notice on that is they're very, a lot of times that will get reported when someone says, hey, this volcano erupted and we dated the lava and it was dated to be 3 million years old, and it's just kind of it's almost like a joke just how far off that dating method is on the lava flow. And so that's I mean, it's fine, it's just kind of they're not trying to refute the Bible by saying that lava is really 3 million years old, because we saw it erupt. But it's kind of interesting, there's a volcano in New Zealand that erupted about 70 years ago, and it dated, some of the potassium argon dating said it erupted 3 million years ago, and so that it's actually in a museum there, and it's like a it's like that example. But then literally you go like 4 exhibits down, and it'll say this volcano erupted 550,000 years ago, and they use the same dating method. Okay, so something that's like 70 years old dated to be 3 million years old, and then there's something that is that you don't know, because no one, it's not recorded or anything else, but they just say as a fact that it was 550,000 years ago. You don't mention anything at all, the uncertainty of that dating method and stuff. So if someone wasn't looking for that, they're just going through a museum, and all they're going to remember is, oh wow, that was really cool, because I think they had like all kinds of like prehistoric looking whatever, running around, as part of the exhibit. And no one's going to realize that, no, they have no idea when that erupted, because they've already established that their error, they can't distinguish between 70 years and 3 million years. So how's it going to say 550,000 years? So that is actually one to keep in mind, because that's an age. If someone hears that age, that again plants the seed. I can't really trust the Bible, based on this age question. It's like, well, yeah, you can. It's just, that's the. It's just not an accurate age, I guess you'd say. Then you have uranium-238 to lead. We talked about the zircon crystals. The helium in the zircons shows that decay had to happen recently. Rubidium, strontium is one, samarium, neodymium ones. Now what's interesting is there's rocks at the bottom of the Grand Canyon that they have those last three dating methods. So you do uranium, lead, rubidium, strontium, and samarium, neodymium on the same rock. But that would be like, a lot of times in those particular rocks, they give different ages. Okay, so they'll have one of the dating methods, I think, is 1.2 billion years old. Another of the dating method is like 1.5 billion years old. Another one is over 2 billion years old. And they show a chart, and I think I have a copy of the chart somewhere, not in these slides. But they, let me just make sure I don't have them here. Yep, don't have it. Okay. So anyway, but the idea is if someone just looks at that chart, they'll say, well, I know it has to be at least 1 billion years old because they have 3 different dating methods all showing it to be over 1 billion years old. But the good charts, they actually show the error bar. Okay, so suppose I was to have I sent this remote out to a lab, and one of the labs said, okay, it's 100 meters long, plus or minus a meter. Okay, so that's one data. They say, well, I want to confirm that. Well, I send it to another lab and it says it's 200 meters long, plus or minus 2 meters. And then I send it to another lab and it says, no, it's 300 meters long, plus or minus 3 meters. Okay, well, I know it's at least 100 meters long, right? Yeah, because that was the lowest measurement. Well, that would be the wrong assumption because all I really know is 2 of those 3 labs have to be wrong. You see why? Because it can't be 100 meters long and 200 meters long and 300 meters long. So the error bars are overlapping. So that's what they call discordances in radiometric dating methods. So in this case of these rocks that are at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, the error bars weren't overlapping. So all you really knew, you didn't know that, oh, they have to be at least 1 billion years old because 3 measurements say they were 1 billion years old. You know that 2 of the 3 measurements have to be wrong, and because they're using the same types of assumptions, especially this, constant radioactive decay rates, could be 1, there's a good chance all 3 are wrong. Okay? So again, that's another long discussion. So does that, well, we'll finish up here and I'll just ask if any more. So this is the changing radioactive decay rates. We'll focus on that. These are just some quotes. I'll just read a couple of quotes just to, but go back to get the original. This one's back all the way back to 2010. Says the sun at 93 million miles away appears to be influencing the decay of radioactive elements inside the Earth, researchers say. Study by Stanford and Purdue scientists found at the core of the sun where nuclear reactions produce neutrinos more slowly than the surface. This phenomenon might explain changing rates of radioactive decay, scientists observed at 2 separate labs, but does not explain why the decay change happens. That violates the laws of physics as we know them. The article asks, how could the nebulous neutrino, which does not interact with normal matter, be affecting decay rates? No one knows. It might be a previously unknown particle instead. So that's actually what makes science fun. Yeah, because if these rates are changing, we don't know why. People are starting to say it's probably a neutrino, but then other people are saying, no, it could be a whole new particle. I mean, again, that's just fun. I mean, and then another quote. Now this is, these are still out on the, I'm sorry, this one was astroparticle physics. And I guess I won't read this. This is where Ohio State mentioned that they're seeing the decay rates. A lot of other labs are also seeing the decay rate, changes in the decay rates now. And then this is some good articles out on the Stanford University website. This one was from 2016. The research that Sturrock learned about in Tucson concerned fluctuations in the rate of decay of radioactive elements. The fluctuations were highly controversial at the time because it had been thought that the decay rate of any radioactive element was constant. Sturrock decided to study these experimental results using analytic techniques that he and Scarlett developed to study neutrinos. Examining the radioactive decay fluctuations, the team found evidence that those fluctuations matched patterns they had found in super Kamiokande neutrino data, each indicating a 1-month oscillation attributable to solar rotation. The likely conclusion is that neutrinos from the sun are directly affecting beta decays. This connection has been theorized by other researchers dating back 25 years, but the Sturrock-Fishback-Scarville analysis has the strongest evidence yet. This relationship holds. A revolution in neutrino research could be underway. So again, this is good. That means money's going to be spent really trying to figure out what's going on here, which is, again, that's advancing true science. And then you're also seeing now alpha and beta emitters are being affected. You're getting reports of these fluctuating decay rates from various labs. And so, again, this is right at the start, but it's really exciting because, again, as long as we keep pursuing true science, it will confirm the Bible, but it will also get at a lot of physical benefits. So it's good, exciting research. Okay, so This will be this one's pretty straightforward. So before we start on this one, any questions at all on radiometric dating and other dating methods? Yeah.
And if God says in his Bible, 1 day is a 1,000 year, 1,000 year is like 1 day for him.
Right.
And if he says, I make the earth in 7 days, do we have to understand those 7 days physical or?
Okay. So I think it's you know, since it's either First Peter or Second Peter of the 1,000 days, you know, days like 1,000 days, 1,000 days like years. So in that context, it's they're wondering why Christ hasn't returned yet, and some of them are saying things have remained the same. And so I think you know, it's just saying that, you know, God's outside of time, and like you know, a day is like 1,000 years. You know, it's kind of like what seems like a long time to us is short to God and short. So it's a kind of a different context. And so I think in Genesis, when because it says day, it also says evening and morning, and gives a number with the day. And in Exodus, when it says, you know, for 7 days, you know, God created the heavens and the earth. So it's just the linguistics would imply it's literal. Now that said, you know, there's a lot of there is a DVD back there, Light Years No Problem, that it's a biblically consistent way of. And it doesn't need dark matter or dark energy or any of those to show that why we see the universe the way we do from an Earth that's 6,000 years old. And then same thing, the author's very careful to say, hey, this might be completely wrong, but it actually works better than the Big Bang Theory. So that's, but then a lot of people also just prefer, well, you know, God made the creation mature. So if like a second after God made Adam and Eve, a doctor had examined them and said, you need to ask the doctor, how old are they? He's not going to say 1 second old, you know. You know, I mean, who knows how old they were when they were created? How many rings are in the trees in the garden? You know, because a tree ring is not just a way to date the tree; it's also structural support. You know, it has a lot of. So again, but the trees are made in 1 day. You know, and then a lot of people say accelerated decay. So
in 1 day?
Yeah, in 1 day. Yeah. So it's exactly. So, but you might count the rings and say, oh, they're 100 years, you know, so I think just the straightforward reading of the Bible, you know, says, you know, 6-day creation about 6,000 years ago, you know, and so that's, you know, so that's very consistent with what we see, but there's probably at least 3 or 4 different ways people approach that, so we don't know exactly how. Like the light years no problem, it's talking gravitational time dilation and how during creation week we're inside the event horizon of a black hole. And this is, you know, state-of-the-art physics. But again, what I like about the person that made it, he's like, hey, I could be completely wrong, but this works. You know, but it doesn't mean that's how God did it. It just means it works. But it could also have been mature creation. Other questions? It's a fun topic because you will get asked, you know, and then just say, well, you know. Not sure, but but
I was just wondering how you see it.
Oh yeah. So I think it's just, I always, sometimes I go at it and think, okay, how could it been made any clearer that God meant literal days? You know, in other words, you know, there was evening, the morning, the, you know, 3rd day, 4th day, you know, and the day, you know, the number with the day, and yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, yeah, just don't know. Yeah, just it was 86,400 seconds. Yeah, I mean, I don't, you know, anyway. So yeah, good question. Any other questions on the dating? Okay, so then we'll just finish up with a few, you know, and then we'll. But again, we'll have time for questions and answers and discussion. One you'll hear is if say take an X-ray of the bones in our arms. And then like you look at the bones in a dog's leg, or you look at muscles, or you look at even like the DNA used to make bones or muscles. We see all these similarities. And so, and again, it goes back to the question about the textbooks. It's almost funny that the textbooks in the US, it's all those similarities have to be because of evolution. If you go out onto like some of the, I want to say it's might be University of British Columbia, one of the like some of the supposed science websites. They'll even this one website that even says, well, If God, why would God have created things this way? God would have obviously mixed and matched and all that. And I'm like, wait, this is a science website. Why is it saying that? Why is it even talking about God if they're supposedly not? But they're just saying, so we know that evolution is true because God wouldn't have done it this way. And you're like, wait a second, how do you know what God would have done? But anyway, so you run into a lot of stuff like that. So, but when we really think about it, when we see these similarities, it's totally consistent with our experience that they're because you have the same creator. And so in other words, if you see I'm sure, well, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but a lot of people will say that they can be driving down the road and turn on the radio and they'll hear a song they've never heard before, but they know who wrote the song. I mean, anybody ever done that? You hear a new song and you're like, well, this had to be written by such and such. Something's happening, but that's okay. This wasn't that detailed of a slide. But again, it's because it was the same musician. I'm horrible at art, but I have some friends that are really good at art, and so you can go in a museum. I was in a museum once, and it was like there was this painting. It had been like on the other side of the trolley tracks out there, and the guy's like, "Oh, that was painted by such and such." And you walk up to it, sure enough, it was painted by that artist. And so what he could do is just even that distance, he could just look at the color scheme, the general characteristics of that painting, and recognize who the artist was. Okay, so same creator. The car models, people can spot a Toyota from a Honda, from a Ford, from a GM. So all of our experiences, you have the same creator. You expect these physical similarities, and of course, from the Bible, we know that God created all life, so you'd expect the physical similarities. And people get into even more detail. If people are eating plants originally and then also going to eat meat, we have to have physical similarities. Otherwise, how are you going to, how would we use plants for nourishment if you didn't have the right similarities? In other words, that we could actually eat plants. So very consistent with the same designer. But the important point there is even though God created all things physically, we expect physical similarities. People are completely different because only people are created in God's image. In other words, you go to Genesis 1:27. People are created in God's image, not animals aren't, plants aren't, and so that's the important difference. So the physical similarities, totally consistent with God creating all life, although that's different than what you'll read a lot of places. But the key is the spiritual difference. Only people are created in God's image. So any questions on that? And I just mentioned that one again, going back to you never know what's going to click with a person. So maybe what's stuck with them is, why do we have all these physical similarities if God created all life? Because admittedly, I think certain apes, they have 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. You could say that those apes are very human-like physically, and so that's where there are there's a really good book and a good DVD back there. It's about 2018 where we figured out that chimps and humans aren't related. And that was because we actually were able to map the chimp genome. And so, but if you go back on the internet, back to like things that are put out on YouTube, like 2005, 2010, there are some very eloquent, very convincing professors or researchers saying that, no, here's proof that chimps and humans have a common ancestor. And what they used, chromosome 2 fusion was one example they used, and they might add one other. Anyway, so we actually got this True Science Advance. We actually mapped the chimp genome in 2018, and it showed those arguments were wrong. But unfortunately, once they're out on the internet, they're going to be there forever. So someone's going to click on the internet, as soon as they search on, it's going to pop up this really well done video from 2005. Nice guy, sounds convincing. Totally wrong, but they're not going to figure that out unless they get the right information. So if you know someone's at the age where they've heard that and they're struggling with that, there's a book and a DVD on the table. Again, they'll be here at the congregation, but just let Tice know or somebody know that you'd like your own copy, and we'll get it sent over right away. So again, similarities, but that's consistent with God creating all life. And again, the important thing isn't the physical similarities, it's the spiritual difference, that only people are created in God's image. Okay, now this one's kind of I want to apologize in advance for this because it's a really racist statement. Well, who here has heard of a man named Charles Darwin? Okay, yeah, most people still have. I mean, this was a long time ago, and pretty much, people are saying now that if he was alive today, he would burn all his books because they're saying he was basically smart enough to know what he was saying was wrong. But it's funny, a lot of people have still heard the name. And so, but one of the unfortunate problems with his ideas was it drove him to being very racist and very sexist. And so if you read his books, these are quotes from The Son of Man, this is the direction it drove him. And so we know this is completely wrong. It's completely wrong scientifically. Most people are saying he would even admit now that he was wrong. But I just want to read the quotes. Now the reason is, we mentioned in the first session how the genome is degrading. Well, if we keep a spiritual focus, it's like everything else when we're evangelizing, you really want to talk to a person where they're at. I guess that's the best way I've heard it described. So, if I have a certain thing that's really important to me, that might not be at all important to that person, basically objectively considering the Bible and obeying the gospel. But it might be really important. So that's when I say you got to meet the person where they're at. Now when we're having this discussion about the genome degrading, if someone is not at all spiritual, in other words, they're totally focused on the physical, you can have some really horrible ideas. And they're already unfortunately starting to do that, where they'll test the DNA of the baby, unborn baby, okay? So they'll test the DNA. You can get that now from just a blood sample from the mother. You can learn a lot about the DNA of the unborn baby. If they think there's a problem with the unborn baby, they'll really pressure the mother into killing the baby, and so we actually have a couple we know from New Zealand, and they have a totally healthy, I think she's 15, 16-year-old now, daughter, that they were told, this was a long time ago when they were pregnant, they were said, well, we think she might have this genetic problem, and so they were pressured to kill her, okay? And so they didn't, obviously, but you'll run into it's the importance of the focus on the spiritual, the true science. Spiritually, if we know things are degrading, that's information we use to meet the person where they're at. In other words, if someone is suffering from a genetic problem, we have to be very sympathetic towards that. But we have to make sure they know that, hey, they are still, they have this incredible, they're more valuable than all the wealth in the world to God. And so it's going to be important for us to realize that yes, the genome is degrading. That will affect how we're evangelizing, but that's how it should just affect, just to know where that person's at, what they might be struggling with. So that's going to be a future reason to stay focused on the spiritual. But anyway, this was from, I think he wrote this book, this is over 150 years ago. So I'm going to read the quotes, and these are completely incorrect technically. Now obviously socially we know they're incorrect also, but just technically they're wrong. But this was presented as science. It says, at some future period not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies. Now I want to stop there. Remember I talked about the very eloquent, very good presentation, very eloquent writing. If you read these books, you have Origin of Species, you have Descent of Man. The writing is phenomenal. And he didn't have ChatGPT. He was really good writer. He's totally wrong, but he was a really good writer. So you can see how he was able to suck people in. I'm guessing he was a good speaker also. But look at the break between man and his nearest allies. Who says that today? I don't know. And but then he goes on, he says, break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian. Okay, so you can see how this is set up. And some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Okay, so that is about as racist as you can get, very eloquently phrased. We know it's completely wrong, both technically and obviously just socially. But again, he still had an influence, because when I said anybody heard of Charles Darwin, it wasn't like, no. It's like, no, a lot of people still heard about his teachings and his writings. And then he spends like 2 or 3 pages developing these last 2 statements. And so again, very eloquent, very convincing. And first one, the average mental power of man must be above that of woman. So it's not even just an opinion. Just from evolution, we know, that men must be, and then it says, thus man has ultimately become superior to women in purchasing place, etc. So you think, okay, well, that was just one guy. Okay, but this is what was taught in the U.S. as science. Okay, so this is the most popular textbook in the U.S. during this time frame. It was 1914, a civic biology. It was kind of funny. They were, we had a trial. It was kind of you call it like a mock trial, where they tried to set up a trial so that they could sue somebody, or the person could be found guilty or not guilty. And then it's basically a ruse to try to get evolution taught in school, and it worked. So they were able to start teaching evolution more in their schools. The trial was in 1925. They actually referred to this textbook. And so this is some of the stuff we were teaching as science in the U.S. It says, at the present time there exists upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instincts, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race in the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, and the Eskimos, and finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians. Okay, so we're teaching this as science, and then we wonder, wow, why did the U.S. have such a problem with racism? And the good news is I think it's gone now. I mean, but why did the U.S. have such a problem? Well, you talk to someone in the 40s or 50s, and they'll just like, well, it's science, because that's what they learned in high school, and it's totally fake science. So there's a lot of social implications to this. The spiritual is the most important. That affects a person's eternity, but it also has a lot of societal effects, and this could also affect a person's eternity, just by them being discriminated against by racism or sexism. So it's again an important topic. I will mention just real quick before we get into, and that was just more questions and discussions. This was actually gave these exact same slides in a public school in the U.S. about 2 months ago, and left out a lot of the scripture, a lot of that we've been talking about, but they were totally good with it, because you notice all the slides themselves are just the technical, and as if you're really looking at true science. So this is a topic that can be discussed, but it's kind of funny. There's so many right now. Of course, the atheists are pretty much total control of a lot of our societies. So if there's even a hint that you might be leaning towards God, they might not let you use a certain venue, or they might not let you talk in a certain area. But this was one. But you can have this kind of discussion very. I guess you almost hate to do it, but you can just keep it totally where they're at. If they don't want you to say anything about you can give them just start encouraging them, start getting them to think about it. Because one of the slides I like ending with is, of course, Romans 1:16, where it talks about how the Bible is the power of salvation. But then also like giving a lot of books, the examples in the book of Acts, and we'll talk about those tomorrow a little bit. But just there's. You go through all the examples in the book of Acts, and it really tells what we do to receive the free gift of salvation. And so that's so rather than again just saying, okay, we need to hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized, and remain faithful. You say, okay, well here's all these examples in the book of Acts, and then let the person read them and conclude it themselves. Because that's actually how my wife and I became Christians. Is we started out completely outside the church, and then tried this, and this. But we would always ask people, what do you think about this? And they would tell us what they thought about that. We visited the church, and we said, what do you think about this? And the elder said, well, it doesn't matter what I think. Let's see what the Bible says. And that's so important. So that's just, again, because that's really what we're talking about here. And then when we talk about eternity, and that's the other thing we didn't really get to talk about today, was just, someone lives to be 100 years old today. That's considered a really long life. Take the longest life in the Bible, 969 years. Both of those are 0 compared to infinity. In other words, 0 compared to eternity. And so that's maybe another thing, depending on who you're talking to, just to really try to get them thinking about, just okay, rather than just focusing on the physical, focusing on your physical life, realize that, and the older person gets, the more that sinks in. You're talking to an 8-year-old. Boy, being a 15-year-old seems like, man, I will never get here. But if you start talking to someone who starts to get a little bit older, 100 years comes up real quick. So anyway, I guess with that, Heis is, he's not giving too many high hand signals, but he is giving me the thumbs up to quit. So, so let's go ahead and open it up to questions and discussions. Yeah.
Do you see in the evolution of the physical parallel the similar things in the evolution of the spiritual?
So, so I think they're almost in a way the opposite. And what I mean by that is we're actually seeing the original perfect creation, and it's degrading physically. And that's what, from the study of the genome, from, everything we're studying, and, people don't agree with that. You look at entropy and, things. Whereas spiritually, I think, at least we have the opportunity to just always grow spiritually. And so once a person becomes a Christian, they start studying the Bible, we have the opportunity, I'll stress that, to always grow. So it's, whereas what we're seeing evolution from a physical observation is things are degrading. And then also, hate to say it, but once we hit about 18 years old, that's when our bodies start to, so it's in a way it's opposite. And I'll mention that there's a guy in was in our congregation recently. He's 95 years old, and he can quote scripture just without even, he gives a sermon without even looking at his notes, but he'll say, like, he tries to study his Bible several hours a day, and he's still learning. And then the kids, it's kind of interesting. He's obviously looking forward to being with Christ in eternity, but he's also like, man, if I every day gives me another opportunity to learn more. So he likes learning more. So I think it's, depending on how you look at it, in a way it's almost the opposite, because we can always keep growing spiritually, but we can't really control, within reason, what's going to happen physically. But great question, great point. Other questions, discussion? Yeah.
I don't really have a question,
Sure.
but I really, really liked how you said that a bug is more intricate, I don't know.
Oh, sophisticated or complicated, or
in comparison to a plane.
Yeah.
Because people can make planes and they can't make bugs.
Yeah.
I'm taking that one along for the kids.
Oh, awesome. Okay, great. Yeah. Great.
We can make it plane with a bug.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions, discussion? Okay, so what other, I believe in maximizing time. So what other, we have 17 minutes. What would you guys like to?
Well, maybe I you have a question.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
So the carbon dating that's a bit above my head. Lots of terms, things
Okay,
that I don't
right.
understand. But say, for instance, they would carbon date Pompeii.
Okay.
That was a volcano. They kind of know when it happened.
Right.
How far is that off in their carbon dating?
Okay. So if they dated the actual lava, there's a good chance they would come up with a million years ago or something, which we know is wrong. So what they might do is try to find a piece of wood, that was in that eruption, and then depending how close to the flood it was, and I should know that, but I can't remember what the accepted date is. But if it was within, say, the last 3,000 years, it should be pretty accurate, the carbon dating, and that's because the carbon-14 to carbon ratio then should be about like it is today. So in other words, nothing, the last major event that would have changed this carbon-14 to carbon ratio was probably the flood. So something happened more than 1,000 years after the flood should be pretty close to accurate based on the current assumptions, because the assumption is basically that carbon-14 to carbon ratio has always been the same. And so 3,000 years ago, it's pretty close to the same as today. Now, when you get back close to the flood, that's where you have these huge changes in the carbon-14 to carbon ratio, because not only two major effects, all the carbon that was buried during the flood, but even then, we don't know what the carbon-14 to carbon ratio was in the original creation. That could still be having an effect, and we don't know how much CO2 in the oceans was released by the oceans being warmed up by the fountains of the Great Deep. So you really can't tell what that carbon-14 to carbon ratio was, and that would be, things that, made or grew around the time of the flood. So you get about 1,000 years after the flood, it should be pretty accurate. But before that, yeah, it's
So you were saying before that in the museum they had the lava, dates.
Oh, yeah.
And they were,
yeah. So the first one they
So-
admitted was wrong.
so, they can kind of pinpoint when Pompeii was. Why don't they accept that the lava, if they carbon date that it's completely off? Do they not see that they're off in their measurements?
Yeah. So they know they're off and they make an adjustment. They just say, oh, there must have been this much argon entrained in the original. So, but see, that's because they know they were off, and so they know what the date was. So they make the adjustment required to make the dating method match what they already knew it was. And so it's
That's
a
not
circular
fair.
region. It's not, yeah. And so that's what, then when they say something like, no one saw this volcano erupt, but it happened 550,000 years ago, hopefully people say, well, you don't know that. But I'm just like, why did they even mention it? Because they don't know. I mean, they're just, that's the number that popped out of their dating method, which they've already shown isn't good to within 3 million years in some cases. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Given how non-valid that method is, are they stopping using it? Are
No, they still use it.
continue just using it?
Yeah, they still use it, yeah. And a lot of times they'll say, well, for really old dates, it's more accurate, or they'll use, but again, and then that's where just the fluctuations in the radioactive decay rate, that should be, I mean, I'm all for taking all the measurements you can and make models, but to me it'd be more, okay, so you're seeing fluctuations and changes in beta emitters and alpha emitters, and then you have these discordances. So you know that, like say they take a rock, well, it's, say someone says, well, I don't know what the age really is, but using these 3 different methods, I get these 3 different dates, right? So then you could start to say, okay, well, this is a certain atomic mass and it's an alpha emitter. This is a certain atomic mass, it's a beta emitter. So then you could start saying, okay, so we know it's the same date, so what changes would have to happen in the decay rates to make that the same date? And there'd be a lot of them. And then you could start saying, okay, then maybe the decay rates are being changed in this way, right? And if you could postulate something and then say, so if that's how, and as a Christian you'd say that's how they were changing based on the flood and creation week, and I could make those match, then maybe that would give me a scientific clue to figure out exactly what is making them change. And so that's one where, again, just you're not allowed to go down that path, because you're saying if you believe the Bible, then if this is what's making them change, then that would explain the data. You're not allowed to pursue that. There's another one, it's another good quote, you don't have to go into it, but there was, back in 2008, 2009, there was, again, these are secular scientists. There's a team of mathematicians and a team of physicists that both concluded they had a way to get rid of the need for dark energy. Okay, so dark energy is one of these big adjustable parameters. Right now it has to be 73% of the universe has to be dark energy. And so they said, based on our observations, if there was a lot of mass beyond the observable universe, that would mimic the effect of dark energy. Okay, so and so in other words, you wouldn't need dark energy anymore, but it would require the Earth be at the center of the universe. Okay, and so they say, so that's not physically relevant. Okay, so you see how they just shut down the discussion, because the Bible doesn't say the Earth's at the center of the universe, but if God did put us at the center of the universe, then just based on our observations, you would eliminate the need for dark energy, which we have no idea what it could be. It makes up 73% of the universe. So again, it's one of those, it's the bothersome thing is they're not allowed to consider it. Because if the Earth is at any special location at all, they say that violates the Copernican principle, which sounds technical, right? Sounds scientific. All the Copernican principle is, it just says everything has to be random. Well, no, Copernicus probably never said that. You know, I mean, it's just, they just say, and so if you have a theory that doesn't allow everything to be random, then that sounds a little too much like maybe God did it, so you're not allowed to even consider it. So you just think about this, mathematicians and physicists both come up with a way to get rid of the need for dark energy. That should be a Nobel Prize. And they probably also, maybe, if you follow that line of reasoning, even says where the Earth is, okay? So now we know where the Earth is, we know how much mass is outside the observable universe, and then we build our cosmology around that. Well, maybe then we actually figure out how the universe is designed, which again, you're not allowed to use that term, you know, how the universe is designed. Once you figure out how it's designed, then maybe figure out how to get around the universe. Because I'm blessed, I'm getting to work on advanced propulsion systems, but our idea of an advanced propulsion system is to be able to go to Mars and back in a year. Okay, that's considered really, really advanced. Well, if it takes me a year to get a person to Mars and back, and they only get like less than 30 days at Mars, well, we're not going much past Mars, right? So there's got to be some physics that we don't understand yet. If God designed the universe so we can really get around the universe, there has to be some physics we don't understand yet. In other words, because otherwise, if I'm just using the best, it's a nuclear propulsion system. I'm using the best propulsion system we can engineer. I can only get to Mars and back. I mean, that's nothing compared to the universe. And so it's holding back science.
Yeah,
Because
shuts
you know,
down everything.
and then the other one, and then what's even funnier is if that is the location of the Earth, then that immediately explains how the universe could look the way it does from an Earth that's 6,000 years old, because you do get things like gravitational time dilation kicking in. So, but you're not allowed to go down that. I mean, how to phrase it? We can go down. What's great about living in free countries, we can go down any path we want to. We just have to do it in our spare time, or still, but you're not allowed to get funding to pursue that, even though it's an obvious path to pursue. And so yeah, a lot of those things kind of tie together. I think the radiometric dating is an area we could learn a lot if we were willing to consider the Bible. I mean, we being the researchers and all the research grants, and definitely our cosmology, we could learn a lot if we were really willing to consider the Bible. Yeah.
Do you, what kind of things do you run into with any of this in your own work then?
So the one,
I mean, any pushback or anything like that?
so you usually do get to ask the question about life making itself, and same thing. No one's ever said it's scientific. So I like asking that one when the opportunity arises, because it gets them to admit that this, even if they've been brought up to be, because a lot of people are people. I mean, you hear about the atheists that are really anti-Christian and they hate Christians, and but most people that are atheists just means that they've always been brought up to not believe in God, and they've never really thought about it. So just having that person acknowledge that, well, yeah, it's not scientific, but it's still what I believe, that's actually a big step towards getting them to consider the Bible. And then the other time I try to say is, okay, so we have something we call planetary protection, but what that basically means is it's not it's not that we're worried about, like at the moon, they quarantined the astronauts when they came back from the moon in case there was a moon bug. So they quarantined the first crew. I think it was a couple of weeks at least. They were in a little quarantine. So that was kind of, they were just, I'm not sure why they did it, because I think everybody knew that. But now the idea is we don't want to send astronauts to Mars, or we don't even send a rover to a point on Mars where there might be water, or we don't want to send a rover or a probe that goes through the ice in Europa, which is a moon of Jupiter where there might be water, because we're afraid we'll bring a bacteria from Earth that will interfere with that bacteria's ability to evolve, assuming there's a bacteria on Europa. And so sometimes they can just say, and it's a true statement, like until we stop pretending that life can make itself, that's really going to hold us back. Because if someone wanted to say, well, maybe a meteorite hit the Earth, and it actually works out, the math works, you could have a meteorite hit the Earth at a certain angle and a certain velocity, they could then kick some dirt back to Mars, and then we have bacteria that could actually survive that, which is really amazing how well the bacteria are designed. So you could theoretically say, okay, so if that bacteria is on Mars, then that's something that our astronauts would have to worry about. But that's not what they're saying. They're trying to pretend, well, maybe life made itself on Mars, or maybe life made itself on Europa. So usually that's as hard as I push on that, was to say, until we stop pretending life could make itself, it's really holding us back. Well, no one can disagree with that. Well, they get mad if you say pretending, but not mad. They don't ever say anything. But that's probably how it's affecting things the most. Is it's limiting how we would do exploration, because like say for Mars, if you're going to send astronauts to Mars, you want to actually be at a place where there's a lot of water and a lot of resources. if we're saying, well, we can't send a rover there because, and we can't drill and we can't see if we can melt water because there might be, life might be trying to evolve itself there, well then we don't get to explore there, so it makes it a lot harder to actually put a colony on Mars. And that's a whole other discussion. You probably read, Elon Musk wants to retire on Mars. It's like, he's got $1 trillion, he can retire wherever he wants to. And so he might actually do it, but it's not, but this whole idea of you can't explore certain places, that's probably the other area that's really holding us back. But yeah, where I'm at, and also within the United States, Alabama is pretty friendly towards the Bible still. A lot of places in the U.S. aren't, but that is so I think a lot of people just in a generally friendlier environment if someone was to try to really, just make things difficult. I don't think they'd get as far as other places in the country. So I guess on that note, just don't be afraid. It's amazing. Never be afraid to talk to somebody about this, because a lot of times you'll know somebody and they might have appeared overtly hostile to Christians or the Bible, and it's amazing. If it's just a one-on-one discussion, it almost always can be a very friendly discussion. I've never had a one-on-one discussion that couldn't be just a very friendly, open exchange of information. Actually it was just a couple weeks ago, I mentioned something, I got to be down in Uruguay and had a geologist, and through the whole talk he was, really good interactive exchange, and just went up to me afterwards, hey, I'm not sure we got to meet again, and through an interpreter, but it was a real friendly discussion, and he actually asked for some resources. I wish I gave him my email, he hasn't emailed yet, but so I'm just saying that the setup was, you think, oh, this person, it's just gonna, hate me personally, no, this is a good, open, objective discussion. So speaking the truth in love, don't ever be afraid to talk to people, just in general. Yeah. Oh, or somebody, yes. Oh, okay, sorry.
Just going back to the carbon-14 thing for a
Sure.
second. So Pompeii is relatively young, but there are other things that are older, like the pyramids, that we have, separate human records that kind of pinpoint
Right.
dates a little bit better. Do you see, or have we seen actual discrepancies in like carbon-14 dating or any other types of radio?
No, it's usually, because the human records do get pretty unreliable, within like the 1,000-year of the flood time frame, there's not too good at human records there. So it's pretty, it's really just when like someone finds like I'll use like a wooden pottery as an example. So someone can find wooden pottery, no real written records associated with it, none that you could really rely on, and they might date it to be 20 or 30,000 years old. But that's not, again, that would be something that was very close to like right after the Tower of Babel, or usually that isn't a civilization that popped up, pretty quick after the Tower of Babel. So, not, there's always like 300 or 400 year type discrepancies, and some people will say, well, we're sure we're right here, and other people say, no, we're sure right over there, and they'll have their evidence and stuff. So nothing, a lot of discussion, but nothing. And that's when we're archaeologically, there's a book, there's I think it's like the Defending the Faith Study Bible. There's a couple copies here. It goes through a lot of the archaeological discoveries, because, I can't remember when everybody thought David was mythical, and they find all kinds of references to David, and but as archaeology is advancing, but not aware of any discrepancies. Now, one thing I will say is, like sometimes they'll say they'll do a carbon dating, and they say, okay, this wooden bowl is I'll say 30,000 years old, and then they'll say, okay, there's some pottery found by that wooden bowl, and it had this much residue on it, and it was this style, and it was this, and then it was in this layer. And so they'll say, okay, so anytime you find pottery with that style and that, with that much residue on it in certain layers, and that's also going to be 30,000 years old. And so, but it always anchors back to the carbon dating. And then they do, so now they're trying to develop another technique. It's like thermoluminescent based, but it's also ultimately calibrated to the carbon dating. So if the carbon dating is wrong, those are also wrong. And so I'll use my remote as an example again. If I said, say I did go to that first lab and it says this remote's 100 meters long, okay? Well, then I could measure my laptop. There's 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters. So my laptop's 300 meters long. Then I could use my laptop and say, okay, this podium is 400 meters long. And then I could walk this podium across this auditorium and say, wow, that congregation, their auditorium is several kilometers wide, and you'd say, well, how did you measure that? Did you use your pointer? Because we know the pointer's wrong. And I say, no, or the remote. It's like, no, I didn't use the remote. I used the podium. Okay, so that's what you get when you start doing pottery styles and this and that. They're all, ultimately, it goes back to being based on carbon dating. And if we're off on the carbon dating because we didn't take into account the effects of the flood and the recent creation, then everything based on that is going to be wrong also. Sure, no, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. This is more a remark than a question. In scientific world, they're trying to explain life by looking at matter. But I think life is more than just matter. It's also something like spirit or soul, how you would call it. And there are Bible verses like it says in one of the Gospels, don't be afraid of people who can kill the body and then they can do anything.
Yeah, just be afraid that you can kill body and soul, yeah.
The soul and the spirit, they are more important than just the body. And there's also this text, it's from Zechariah 12 verse 1, it says, "Thus says the Lord who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him." This spiritual part is completely denied or ignored by science, probably because they can't handle it.
Right.
And I think you can't have life without this spiritual part.
No, I think you're absolutely right, yeah.
And some people think God is just watching what is going to happen. He's creating spirits. He's busy.
Yeah.
So that's what I
and
want to say.
the verse you mentioned too, it says stretches out the heavens. Just the physics of how the universe appears the way it does from an Earth that's 6,000 years old. Yeah, we're just now starting, okay, if you postulate a fabric of time and space, which is one idea out there, and then you stretch it, what does that do to radioactive decay rates? And so, if you guys can get back with me later tonight or tomorrow, no, I mean, no one knows. I mean, that's just like really pushing everything. So excellent comment. And I agree completely. Life is the spirit.
Last one. Is heaven past the universe?
It's outside the dimension of time. It's going to be an eternity. So it's and so that's another question you get. Okay, so two more. You ever hear the question, if God made the universe, who made God? Anybody ever hear that question? Okay, so just a way to explain it's kind of like what you were saying is first verse of the Bible, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So not only did God create the heavens and the earth, he also created the dimension of time. So then the question back would be, okay, if God created time, he must be outside of time. Can anything outside of time have a beginning or an end? Okay, this is a strange one, but you're outside the dimension of time, which is hard enough to figure out. Then can anything outside the dimension of time have a beginning or an end? And it can't, because the word beginning and end, they don't make any sense outside the dimension of time. And so that's where heaven, we're going to be with God for eternity. So it's different, and so the only reason I wouldn't say beyond the years because it's different. It's not just, we just go a little further, but it's, no, it is important because you have people, I actually had a teenager that left the church because someone had told him that if he flew up in an airplane, he'd see angels sitting on the clouds when he was like really little, and he believed it. And so that was one of the reasons he gave for wanting to leave the church. And then the other one was, how could all the animals fit on Noah's Ark? And so if you go to, you look at the dimensions of the ark, the number of kinds of animals, easily fit, and then you can easily feed it. It's less than, I want to say it's like 7,000 animals total or less because it's not species, it's at the kind of, that was the other reason he left the church. So these are actually really, really important questions because you never know what's going to stick with somebody that say, well, that's why I can't believe the Bible because there aren't angels sitting on top of the clouds. And you're like, well, I don't remember that in the Bible, but yeah.
And because God separated the waters from that roof.
Yeah.
And I thought there was water on Mars.
Yeah, so if there's mass above the universe, that gives for the need for dark energy. So you might be right.
How I understand it, there must be a roof.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are, because he created everything with water.
Yeah.
And he separated it.
Yeah.
I think he separated in the complete universe.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah.
How do you see that?
yeah.
Because
Lot
some
of
people
ways you
they
could-
see it as here on the clouds. He separated.
Yeah, so if the stars, you know, sun, moon, and stars are in the firmament, you have the waters above the firmament, the waters below the firmament. If the waters above the firmament are what we can't see, then that gets rid of the need for dark energy and explains why the universe appears the way it does when Earth is 6,000 years old. But it doesn't mean, you know, that's one of those ones where you really wish there'd been a science, never mind, I wouldn't go there. You know, like you want like, the Bible's this thick, you wish it was like this thick so it could answer some more of these questions, but it still couldn't answer all of them, obviously. So, thank you. Thanks, buddy.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for this time together.